Welcome to South Coast Matters. I'm Paul Latendra.
And I'm Julie Taylor. And South Coast Matters is a public access television program where we bring together civic leaders, business leaders, and citizens to discuss how we can have a positive impact on our South Coast communities.
And we try to have interesting conversations with some interesting people. And today's interesting person is Michael Goodman, Dr. Michael Goodman. And today's part two of a discussion we started on our last show. And it really we had intended for it to be a short discussion on one item, and we talked about everything but. So I won't tell you what we're talking about today, because no matter what we decide to talk about, we'll talk about something else. But Michael is Executive Director of Public Policy Center. He's former chair of UMass Dartmouth Department of Public Policy, and former director of UMass Dartmouth Center for Public Analysis, CFPA.
And also co-editor of Mass Benchmarks. It's the Journal of the Massachusetts Economy, published by UMass's Donahue Institute in cooperation with the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Mm-hmm. So now, would you consider yourself a bipartisan institute, or how? I know everybody has to have some level.
We're nonpartisan. So the Public Policy Center is focused on evidence-based analysis that's all designed to inform good policy making at the state, local, and regional level. So we're not politically active.
Good.
No.
So people should go check out your figures and know they're getting the straight story then.
That's right. We're doing the best that we can to pull the information together, present it so that citizens, policymakers, and other interested observers can make good decisions.
That's excellent.
And your primary mission is to promote the public's understanding of the critical economic and policy challenges facing Massachusetts.
Yes, sir.
And that's why we have you here.
Well, it's a
because
pleasure
we
to be
can't
here.
figure out any of that stuff.
Well, I'll do my best.
Okay. Can we bring up the first slide? We want to talk about how real estate affects education, how education affects job and property values.
Sure.
And how property values affect quality of life.
All right, so this is basically a snapshot of the recent history. We don't have the 2015 data in hand yet, of the tax base of two of the South Coast's major cities, Fall River and New Bedford. And over the last several years, we've seen in Massachusetts and across the nation a strong recovery in housing prices, residential property values, commercial property values, particularly driven in areas of the country which, as we discussed last time, have been driven by innovation and high technology and knowledge-intensive business enterprises, while those parts of the state and the nation that don't have as many strengths in those areas have lagged. And one metric that helps to highlight that has been the sort of flat, the steady decline in the years since the Great Recession. So it was much worse during the recession, and in the years since, we haven't seen very much upward lift in property values. Now,
what's the blue line and the green line?
Yeah, the blue shows the residential property values in each community, and then the green on top is the value of the commercial and industrial land in the community. Again, this is the tax base. This is where the tax rate is levied. This provides the community with the resources it needs to operate its schools, to provide critical services, public safety, police, fire, fix potholes. There's plenty of those to fix, as we all know. And so when the tax base is flat or declining, that's really put some serious pressure on local finances. And so the story of Fall River and New Bedford in recent years is not much different. They've actually been doing a very good job, both cities, in terms of promoting economic development, but they're fighting an uphill battle because many of the forces that are shaping the contemporary economy value things that are not in abundance there.
Can we get the next slide, Ben?
Right. The other issue, and it's a region-wide issue, but especially acute in our urban communities, is the relatively low educational attainment of the working-age population. As we discussed last time, there's this increasing advantage to having a high level of educational attainment.
What came first, the chicken or the egg, the low tax base or the low education attainment?
I actually think that the skill level of the workforce and a number of other economic factors very much help to explain the lagging performance of property values in this end of the state. I think where you see higher levels of education, you see higher levels of job growth, you see rising incomes, you see funds to support the amenities that investors, business owners, and families seek, that is, quality public schools, safe streets, high quality of life. Both of these cities, I think, have a lot to offer. They're wonderful places to be. In some cases, suffer from bad publicity, which can make it more difficult. But there's no question that the relatively low levels of educational attainment in our urban communities, and these are just two, make it much more difficult for them to compete in the modern economy.
Why aren't secondary manufacturers or secondary service companies that would service the GEs, et cetera, who are moving into Boston, why aren't they setting up shop in Fall River and New Bedford?
Well, in many cases they are. I have the pleasure and the privilege of serving on the Economic Assistance Coordinating Council, which deals with all of the tax increment financing and other economic development incentives statewide. And these two communities in particular have been very active participants and have very active and effective economic development operations. Fall River Office of Economic Development, New Bedford Economic Development Council in particular. But those manufacturers no longer rely on people who have lower levels of skill. Those jobs have been moved overseas or have been automated. In many cases, automation is as big a deal as the outsourcing and globalization. And so what's left in those communities is a search for certain kinds of management positions, certain kinds of highly technically skilled production workers, and so there is definitely a gap in manufacturing between the available skills in the local workforce and the requirements of these growing employers. I think that's a niche problem, but I do think where we've seen growth, we do see better educational outcomes, and so if there's a chicken and the egg here, I think what came first was the lack of skill and educational achievement.
Well, one thing we do have going for us in this region is we have a very great community college.
Sure do.
In Bristol Community College, which has campuses in New Bedford. It has it in
they do great stuff.
Taunton, Fall River, and then Brockton has Massasoit Community College. So I mean, this area is fortunate to have those institutions that can work with employers to provide skills and help.
Absolutely, and even though there are opportunities for high school students to access those, say, BCC or even UMass or Bridgewater State, we've got to get those students out of the high schools with the level of skill that's and achievement that's going to allow them to succeed at the post-secondary level. And even though there has been some improvement in that regard in our urban communities in this region, we still have a lot of work to do. So I think it's not all bad news,
right.
But if we're trying to understand why we're lagging, we should make no mistake that that's the thing that we need to change if we're going to have sustainable opportunities and economic growth in this region over the long run.
So now when we have students coming out of high school and they're going to Bristol community and they're in need of these remedial services before they can even begin to, you know, the challenging courses they need for their degree work, what would be needed in the public schools in order for them to come out fully prepared to go to school?
Wow, that's a big question. So I would defer to my colleagues at BCC on the details, but I think we're still not in a place where our comprehensive urban high schools are graduating in many cases 80% of their students even, right? So if you've got 1 in 5 of the young people in your community that's not even making it out of high school, what you're doing is you're sentencing those young people to, you know, a life of missed opportunities and extraordinarily low levels of income. So, I mean, I think we do have a challenge in education in Massachusetts where the different levels of the system, the K-12 system, the vocational education system, community colleges, the state universities, the public university, UMass system, needs to do a better job of working together. But again, the critical work and the need for progress is at the K-12 level, where in many cases they're doing as much as they can do with the resources and the assets that they have. They need more, not less, and so I think that's been a real challenge too. But we've got to figure out a way to get it right.
Is there something within the ed reform legislation where less can go to the schools in the suburban schools where the taxpayer base takes pretty good care of funding education, and funnel more funds to these schools like the gateway cities that really need it.
Yes, and that does happen. The Educational Reform Act in 1993 set up Chapter 70 funding for local public schools, and that formula, which hasn't been touched since, to my knowledge, does privilege communities that have high levels of disadvantage or don't have the tax capacity to raise what they call the foundation budget, what the state believes is the minimum level you should spend in order to get a respectable outcome that's required by our state constitution, right? So it was a family in Brockton that sued the state back then to say, hey, we're not getting our constitutionally required high quality education, and that's what really prompted those efforts. And so I think the problem is that we haven't revisited what the foundation budget should be in a very long time. The Chapter 70 budget is a zero-sum game, meaning if we tweak it in the favor of one community, it has to come at the expense of another. So it becomes a very politically difficult thing for our legislators and our governors to do. So I think it's been a wonderful way of helping to close some of these gaps, but we still have a long way to go.
The South Coast is the underfed, underclothed child, I think, of Massachusetts. And sometimes I almost feel like I'm a Rhode Island resident living in the South Coast.
Oh, interesting.
Well, we certainly we're part of the Rhode Island media market more than we are and I certainly knew a lot more about Buddy Cianci before he passed away than I did about any Massachusetts politicians.
Huh.
I see transportation as a big issue as far as why we're not getting our due costs down here, why Boston folks who are earning the $200,000 a year aren't buying homes down here, because you can hardly live in Boston on $200 grand a year these days. But it might be an exaggeration. But,
A little bit.
yeah. But with Route 24 being a bottleneck, and there's really no way to get from Boston to New Bedford without doing 140, so that's a bottleneck. We have limited access to the rest of the state.
Well, we have transportation issues statewide, as I think most everybody who's listening can attest. We had that very difficult winter last year, which exposed decades of underinvestment in the biggest public transit system in the state, the MBTA, and meanwhile, the rest of the state that's been waiting for quite a while for its investments, down here, SouthCoast Rail and other regions of the state,
that's what I was getting at, SouthCoast Rail.
Other extensions of service have been forced to wait while we sort that out and try to figure out how to fix that. I live in Waltham and commute to Dartmouth, and it's smooth sailing, going south in the morning and going north in the evening, at least until I get to Route 128. But I do see those unfortunate souls who are on the other side of the highway, trudging very slowly each day to access those job opportunities. Now, there is commuter rail access in places in Lakeville and in Brockton and in Taunton. So we're really talking about the southern end of the region, the traditional South Coast, the New Bedford to Fall River.
Does Taunton have commuter?
Don't they have access to a station? Oh no, they're planned if the South Coast Rail comes through. Yeah. So it's really Brockton and
Bridgewater, Attleboro,
and Lakeville, the Lakeville line. Well, yeah, forgive me for making that mistake. But in any case, I do think more and better transportation options would open up this end of the state. When we had the big run-up in housing prices at the end of the 90s and the early years, we did see more population growth down here for the reasons you mentioned, right? A higher quality of life, lower cost, but what do you have to tolerate? A difficult commute.
Sure.
And so I do think rail access would improve that.
And not only the South Coast Rail, you have to think about the regional transit authorities too, that don't really interconnect with each other. So if the South Coast Rail were to come through, they still have to get those regional transportation authorities with the buses to coordinate schedules so that people who need to get somewhere can get somewhere.
Right, and that coordination is an issue, I think, statewide as well as here in the region. I think that's manageable. I think the challenge has been mustering the will to make the big investment and extending the service, and the tension, I think, between making investments where there are real crisis conditions in the core Boston area, right now where the lion's share of the economic activity is taking place, and extending opportunities and access to regions outside of Greater Boston, like southeastern Massachusetts. But I will say, when I hear in the state capitol people talking about the North-South Connector, which is let's build a big tunnel under the financial district to connect two stations that are really only a mile apart for untold billions of dollars, I scratch my head. So I do think we are home in this region to wonderful legislative advocates, a very powerful legislative delegation that I know is on the job trying to do right by the people who live here.
That north-south railing's another whole discussion.
I know,
too.
yeah.
That's a terrible idea.
I'll continue to bring back the example of the Eisenhower highway system when that was being built. There was a great deal of objection to government takeover of private lands to build these highways that nobody really wanted. That highway system's the backbone of our country right now. That's the blood veins that feeds our country. I think the rail system, we're going to be more dependent on rails in the future, where independent, I think we've peaked as far as car ownership.
We'll see.
There's no place to put cars in the city. I mean, you just can't bring too many more automobiles into Boston.
Well, technology is really kind of a disruptive factor in all of this. It's not clear when it's going to happen, but the technology is getting to the point where driverless vehicles are a potential reality. Maybe not in the immediate future for people like us, but when you're thinking about freight and transportation and hauling, those kinds of things, I think, are going to start to be automated sooner rather than later. And there'll be some jobs that are lost as a result, but some efficiencies and safety and cost savings as well. So I think it's hard to predict where we're going. I will say this, though, for environmental reasons, for regional economic development reasons, that making it easier to get from point A to point B makes sense. And anybody who's had the opportunity to travel outside of the United States recently knows that it's possible, that it happens in places that are less well developed than we are, where you can travel very rapidly. I think I had a colleague who visited China who said he was about 2 hours away by car from the city he needed to be in, where they put the airport, 20 minutes on a train, a high-speed train. Later he was there. So imagine going 2-hour car drive, 20 minutes on a train. It can be done. Yeah. I think it would be incredibly difficult to do here now, given our infrastructure, but technology is game-changing in many ways, and so I think it's hard to predict where we're going.
But it does seem that millennials are less interested in driving, and they're more environmentally conscious, so maybe as they come into control or power, or how you want to say it.
I haven't quite figured out whether millennials don't like cars or whether they can't afford cars, and so I think the jury's still out. But I think you're right. They definitely seem to prefer an urban environment. They're looking for more cultural opportunities. They're looking for ways to cut their expenses. I think some of that is out of necessity. So smaller housing units, more likely to rent rather than to own, and more likely to highly value public transportation, does seem to be something that's characteristic of that generation. What happens when they get older and they have children? Will they
want to move out to the SouthCoast?
Will they still want to live with a roommate or in a 200 square foot apartment? I'm not so sure, but they definitely are a different generation. I'm raising one.
Oh, so now that made me think.
I've raised one.
The demographics of the state are growing older.
Yes.
So now how about
and
all
more
these...
diverse.
Yeah, so all these issues we've been talking about, we haven't really addressed older people.
No. Well, so one of the things that's going to be a governor on our growth, that is, it's going to limit our growth going forward, is the availability of workers, because as the baby boom generation ages, and we're at the leading edge of that phenomenon here in Massachusetts, people do tend to retire, and even if they're not inclined to retire, they tend to become, to have medical problems, to become disabled. So over time, their participation in the labor market, understandably, is reduced. And so if we're not replacing them quickly enough, then you end up with fewer workers, right? And so I think right now, if you look at the latest New England Economic Partnership economic forecast for the state, job growth is expected to slow primarily because of the slowing growth of the labor force. Now, in about 10 years or so, those millennials will be old enough in many cases to start to step in and take the place of those that have retired if those jobs continue to exist. But in the meantime, I think there's going to be a crunch. What's interesting about that, though, is there's another way to make new workers, the old-fashioned way, right? Having children and raising them is certainly continues to be very important. It's not going away. But immigration is something we've come to rely on. Immigration from outside of the country primarily. If you look at the trade balance that Massachusetts has in terms of people moving here from other places or people moving from here to other places, it's always a little negative here. We have a lot of college students that come here and graduate students to get educated. And many times when they're done, they go back where they came from or they go to some other place, and that's natural. So I think for Massachusetts, given what's going on in immigration policy, a more sensible, economic development focused, skills focused immigration policy at the national level is a no-brainer.
Because if you're talking about those highly skilled workers that are coming from China or India or whatever, they come here, I would personally prefer they would stay here and start their business here and produce jobs here than to say, we don't want you, go back where you came from, and have them start something over there.
Well, I mean, immigration isn't all benefits and no costs, to be sure. But I think we just recently did an analysis of the foreign-born population in Worcester, my colleagues and I at the Public Policy Center at UMass Dartmouth. And what we discovered was those foreign-born individuals in Worcester were more likely to own their own business, just as likely to be working. We actually prevent them from legally from getting most public services except for emergency health care. And so when you look at the cost and the benefits, there are costs to be sure, but they are outweighed in many cases by those benefits. And frankly, I mean, I'm not a Native American, so I'm almost a couple generations away from being an immigrant, and certainly this is a region in Massachusetts in particular that's been home to immigrants from all around the world, most especially European immigrants and Portuguese immigrants in particular. And so I find it more than a little ironic that this is a part of the state that seems to be so skeptical about immigration. And so it's an interesting thing to try to reconcile. But I think we have to be honest about the costs and the benefits and what our needs are, and then ultimately craft the policy that makes the most sense for us.
I don't quite understand the demographics going forward. I understand where we'll be. We're going to be a much larger percentage of people out of the workforce between 65. We live too long. We're screwing up the economy, basically.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, I wouldn't quite go there.
But we're going to have, I want to say, like 35–40% of human beings in this area will be over 65 within 20 years or so.
Yeah.
And we'll have more people over 65 than we do under 20. Was that the numbers we came up with?
We're a graying state.
What?
We're a graying state.
Yeah, very graying.
Yeah, but it's not a static state. So right. So as these imbalances grow larger, right, employers respond. If they can't find the workers they need, they have to make the opportunities more appealing so that someone from another state or someone from another job will take their job. I think where we're going to have a real problem is in the human services and healthcare sectors, where we're going to need lots and lots and lots of people to provide our elders with personal care and assistance. Not always medical care, but sometimes just personal care that allows them to stay in their own home and to live their golden years with some dignity. Those jobs are very emotionally intense. They don't pay very well. And so they're hard to fill. And in an environment where there are fewer workers available, difficult jobs that pay poorly are going to be the hardest ones to fill. So I think we definitely have our work cut out for us as a society. Again, another issue that I think making it easier for people to come here from elsewhere strategically makes more sense.
So in the few minutes we have remaining, why don't you give us the picture of what's great economically about the South Coast, so we can all be so excited that we live here.
You know, I think the South Coast is really a great place. I'm converted. I work in the region. I don't live in the region, and so I value the perspective that I have as an outsider.
So when are you moving here, Mofo?
I was just going to say, when are you going to leave? for a family come here?
It's going to have to be you and my wife who are going to have to sort that out. I'm the we have one son, and so I'm the assistant to the vice president in my own house. So, I'm in charge at work and not so in charge at home. So I'll put you two together, and you can sell her. I would prefer a shorter commute. I think the quality of life is extremely high. The history is wonderful and inspiring. I think the arts and cultural offerings in the region are spectacular. The physical beauty and the access to the coastline are, I think, without peer in New England, and that's saying something. I do think on the economic side, while there are many challenges, we're leaders in many areas of the economy. There are still areas of precision and technical manufacturing where the best work in the state and the world is being done here. I think we have very promising possible opportunities in renewable energy and alternative energy. As some like to say, we're home to the Saudi Arabia of wind off the shore of Buzzard Bay and the immediate greater New Bedford area. And so I think there's a lot of promise and there's a lot of potential. The people here, I think, are good, solid, decent, friendly people who have a long tradition of being kind, good to one another, and hardworking. So I think all those things make this a fantastic place to live and work. I think where we're lagging is in access to some of those opportunities through the transportation system, and in particular where I think we really stand out is in the poor performance of many of our educational systems in terms of the outcomes. So I don't think we've done right by our
level,
cities.
you're saying?
Primarily, I mean, again, we all have, I think we can all do better, but I do think the K-12 schools, particularly in our cities, work very hard, face tremendous challenges, but still compare unfavorably to their counterparts in many cases.
And I think that the rest of the communities in the South Coast can't live in our own little bubbles and not worry about Fall River, New Bedford, Brockton, Taunton, and want those schools to succeed and want those kids to have the opportunities.
Look, if we're really a commonwealth and
Right.
all that means, right, that means we should be looking out for one another. We should see in our neighbors the same opportunities that we see in our own households. But even more than that, where do you go for those cultural experiences, for those artistic experiences, to eat dinner,
Right.
to go to a museum? These are places that you can only find in cities, and I think the deterioration that our cities have experienced in the last 40 or 50 years is disgraceful, I think, in human terms. But I think, why would anybody want to be here if it wasn't for those places? And I haven't heard a good answer to that yet. And so I think we need an urban policy at the state level, and I think many of our neighbors in suburban communities need to take a second look at these cities and see that there is a common destiny.
And we need you to keep singing that song, Michael.
Yeah, well, it's a living.
Okay. My name is Paul Latendra. Thank you to Executive Director of Public Policy Center at UMass Dartmouth. It's the name of it? It's
Oh,
the,
yep.
okay.
Yep.
You
got it.
Okay. I thought there was another name to it. And Dr. Michael Goodman. And thank you to Kim Murphy and Ben Fortier and Walter Sabina at TCAM in Taunton for helping us to put on this show. Without them, we don't have a show.
So look for us on Facebook at South Coast Matters, and feel free to email us with comments, suggestions, story ideas at southcoastmatters@gmail.com.
Thanks for being here. Thanks.